Vassily Ivanchuk has to win on demand against Magnus Carlsen in this game. The game begins. Ivanchuk opens the game with 1 e4. Now Magnus with the black pieces. In game number 1, he had run into some opening problems against Ivanchuk. Let's see how things pan out today. Knight comes out to f3 and Magnus plays his knight to c6. A very solid opening by Magnus, of course, who needs just a draw. And we have the Ruy Lopez by Ivanchuk. Very interesting. a6 played. And now bishop to a4. Let's see what is the variation that Magnus chooses. He brings his knight out, attacking the pawn in the center. Ivanchuk castles here. Magnus is not going to go for open variation of the Spanish. He goes for the closed variation. He plays bishop to e7. Now the rook comes out, defends the pawn. And now the threat is to take here and take the pawn on e5. So black plays his pawn up to b5. Bishop moves to b3. And now black castles. White plays the anti-martial move c3. If you all know, c3 leads to the martial with d5 here, but a4 is an anti-martial, and Magnus plays rook b8, which is one of the main lines. Pawn takes here. Ivanchuk pushes his pawn to c3. This move has double ideas. One is bishop can come back. Second is to hit the center. Magnus pushes his pawn forward, and Ivanchuk, almost about to make his move, pushes it to d4. Now white has excellent central control. Magnus takes it, and this is a very risky approach that he's taking towards the opening, because he's giving white a very strong center. Generally you want to keep it intact, but he has a plan, which is to strike back with his pawn, and after e5 he can actually jump in with his knight, and that is what makes this a decent maneuver for black. Now the knight in the center is well positioned. Ivanchuk instantly attacks it and tells Magnus to move it away. Magnus chops off the knight on c3 because the d5 pawn was also hanging. Now pawn takes back. The center control is very powerful, and Magnus does something important. He places his bishop on an important diagonal so that white does not get hold of that diagonal. Ivanchuk goes h3. Maybe later on he might want to push his pawn up to g4. Queen comes up to d7. Is this the right time when you can push pawn to g4? Maybe, but then the bishop just drops back on g6. So Ivanchuk first develops his bishop. He has got a fighting position out of the opening, which is something important when you're playing a must-win game. The knight goes to d8, and now this is not the best idea. Magnus wants to get his knight to e6, perhaps then push his pawn to c6, or even some point go c5. Ivanchuk plays his knight to d2, and guys, this is getting very intense, because Ivanchuk can now start hurling his pawns down the board. Magnus must be careful, and so he gets a bit impatient and pushes his pawn forward. But this is actually a mistake, because now Ivanchuk can push his pawn up c4, excellent move, and he is positionally better. Magnus is doing really well. He has to take the pawn. He takes it, and now you can take with the knight. You can also take with the bishop. Ivanchuk prefers the bishop because then the queen can come here. The knight can move to b3. It's already looking quite dangerous for Magnus. c6 played, and now can you go rook a6? Put pressure here. Get the knight to b3. Maybe knight a5. He goes queen a4, which is also a decent move. And Magnus now needs to decide what is the way in which he's creating counterplay here. He goes rook to b7, defending the queen and just putting it there. Now the knight comes to f1. An important move. He wants to play his knight to g3, and now knight e6. This entire idea of knight f1, knight g3 may not have been the best for Ivanchuk. He's attacking the pawn here, the bishop here. The bishop moves back, and now the d4 pawn is under pressure. Ivanchuk can defend it with rook d1. Yes, he defends the pawn, and now Magnus can actually relocate his knight. That's a great move, knight c7. You can see how Magnus is beautifully maneuvering his knight. From c6 it went to d8 to e6 to c7, and now goes to d5. Queen comes up to b3, and the knight jumps in to d5. Rook goes to a5, putting pressure here. The bishop is putting pressure on the knight. Rook a7 played, and now the white rook can actually enter here. Yes, he plays rook d a1, and d5 is under pressure, but Magnus does not really care about it. He doubles his rook down the a file. So now you can't really win this pawn because your rook on a1 is hanging. So Ivanchuk takes once, takes twice, but you can see the expression on his face. He's not particularly happy with his position, and Magnus has made a positional pawn sacrifice. Ivanchuk does not even think about it, that take here, because he thinks this pawn is very dangerous. So he plays knight e2, queen comes to a3, and now Ivanchuk plays bishop c1 and offers a draw to Magnus. Now Magnus can actually take a draw here because he's already through to the next round if he accepts the draw, but he does not take it. And of course there is rating points at stake, but also Magnus loves to keep playing and sort of, he enjoys these end games. So he goes bishop d3, and he tells Ivanchuk, what will you do? So Ivanchuk plays his knight to f4. It's quite a difficult situation to be in Ivanchuk's shoes right now, because on one hand your position is drawish, it's also unpleasant slightly. On the other hand, even if you really defend well and hold a draw, it's not like you're going to get into the next round or into the tie breaks. It's still like you're going back home. So pawn takes, and now Magnus has an outside passer here on b4. So bishop takes c5, and pawn pushes forward to e6. It's a good move by Ivanchuk, king f8, and he's trying to exchange as many pieces he can. The only issue with this entire thing is that Magnus is going to get his bishop back, which he does, and take this pawn, and eventually this pawn will be a passer. However, the problem here is that after bishop f7, bishop takes, Magnus takes with the king. This pawn is not going anywhere. King e2, and if you play b3, I'm coming king, maybe bishop e5 is better. Just defend this pawn. So he plays his bishop to d4. The king comes up, and this is a big mistake. Ivanchuk should have played maybe just f3 and saved his pawn, but he goes king d3, and Magnus is excited because bishop d3, bishop takes f2, and now he's just plundered a pawn. Ivanchuk goes bishop d2, but Magnus simply defends his bishop to c5, king c4, and now bishop f8. So clearly taking this pawn leads to a lost king and pawn endgame. We'll explore that. He resigns, but actually Ivanchuk could have gone g4, bishop f4, created some kind of a barrier. It's still not clear if this is winning at all. But he just resigns. He felt a little bit hopeless there, and Magnus Carlsen makes it 2-0 and goes to the next round, the quarterfinals of the World Cup. In this position, Vassily Ivanchuk resigned. However, if he had gone into this pawn endgame, the finish is quite instructive. Black goes king e6, king c4, king e5, king d3, king comes here, king e2, king g3, and king f1. And here you need to find the only move to win, and that is king h2. It's very important because if you were to push your pawn to g5, then king g1 is a draw. And so you first go king h2, he plays his king up to f2, and now once again the only move to win here is g5. If you were to play your pawn up to h5, then in this position, white goes h3, followed by g3, and he is drawing it easily. So g5, now you can't play g4 because you lose the h3 pawn. So you kind of wait here with your king to f3. I play h5. Now you need to go back, and then I play g4. You need to take, I take, and now the only move here is king f1, and after g3, you lose this pawn and the game. This is how the game could have ended if you had gone into king and pawn endgame, but it is very clear that Ivanchuk need not have taken this pawn. He could have gone g4 here in this position, and he could have continued the fight after bishop f8, g4, and the game still goes on. White did have some defensive chances.